In the Ruhr highlands in April, the air still held the damp chill of early spring. Night frost lay in a thin skin over the shattered roadway at dawn, as if it had settled deliberately into every shell crack and pothole, turning them into a pattern of damage long since burned into the earth. Since the American 1st and 9th Armies had linked up from the west and north, every road, spur, river valley, and factory complex in this dense industrial region had been absorbed into a single, tightening pocket. The arrows and grayed-out zones on the maps changed daily, then hourly, finally converging toward a conclusion almost beyond reversal. Thousands of small units were compressed in less than a week into isolated dots and splinters. The medical system fractured even earlier than the combat formations. Without vehicles, orders, or drugs, it became something like a skeleton without joints, a structure that existed more as memory than as function. Alfred Leitner woke before dawn and noticed, first of all, not the guns nor the light on the horizon, but the way the wooden crates and medical canvas no longer matched the exact angles he had arranged the day before. He needed a few seconds to recognize the place around him as what had been, until yesterday afternoon, the forward aid post of the 116th Panzer Division. The canvas had been ripped away from its stakes and flapped limply in the wind. Equipment cabinets lay on their sides in the mud. One of the sterilizing kettles had been thrown half over, its heavy base sunk deep into the soft earth. He sat up with the sequence of movements drilled into him in training. First check the torso, then the sides, then sit. But everything his eyes landed on contradicted the idea of a temporarily disrupted aid post that could be restored to operation after a few hours of work. Scattered single shots still echoed now and then from the southern part of the pocket, but they no longer carried any sense of a front. They were more like the aftersound of a battle already decided, bouncing off the hills and factory walls in a ragged rhythm. This region, whose life had once been defined by timetables, rail manifests, production charts, and shift rosters, had been reduced to isolated bursts of noise over a carpet of debris. Once, Leitner's world had possessed a clear structure: patient, record, procedure, instrument. Each term referred to a particular defined action, and the sequence of those actions made up his way of existing. Now the only thing that still connected him to that past was the faded red crosspatch on his sleeve. Smoke had darkened the cloth, but the stitching remained tight, the shape intact. The previous night's shelling had destroyed the core of the aid station. Light stretcher carts lay overturned, medicine chests had burst apart, glass vials and syringes were scattered across the dirt, catching the first grey light in small, broken reflections. More serious than the physical damage was the absence of any functioning chain of command. The senior medical officer had withdrawn during the night and never returned. The wounded and stragglers nearby had drifted away or collapsed wherever they were. Any attempt to reassemble a working medical unit seemed pointless. The air smelled of coal smoke, torn earth, and spilled fuel, a reminder that this was an industrial landscape as much as a battlefield. Explosions here did not merely tear up trenches. They ripped through networks, rail lines, power cables, factory piping, the linked systems that made a rear area work. When those failed, the front could still fire a few days, the medical services could not. After a brief pause, Leitner began to inventory what remained. Counting was the only way he knew to push back the sense of formlessness. He picked a bandage roll out of the mud, cut away the soaked and filthy end with the small scissors he kept in his pocket. He tried to right a storage rack that lay half in a crater, even though its frame was bent and the shelves could no longer sit straight. He noted where the sterilizer had fallen, where the dressing tray had slid. His movements were small and continuous, but lacked the previous unhurried confidence. Cold seeped from the wet ground into his shoes and up through his feet, but he kept working at a pair of forceps whose tips had been bent. He knew they would never be used again. That did not alter his need to place them in the correct spot in the layout. Across the tangle of river valleys and factory belts, retreating German columns had left behind burning wrecks still ticking and popping with heat. In some places, fuel could be seen seeping away in thin, dark streams along the sloped ground. The 116th Panzer Division was only one fragment in the huge ring of destruction. Model had already abandoned plans for any coordinated breakout and had told his commands 2 days before to seek their own salvation. In many units, this translated simply into, "There are no more orders." Combat troops could read that as a signal to slip away, find a gap, or surrender if cornered. For medical staff, it meant something else, something heavier. They did not operate with guns, but with a technology that needed structure. Trucks, depots, central stores, written authorizations. When the backbone of that structure dissolved, they were left not only without protection, but without meaning. By the time the low cloud lifted, revealing a pale strip of morning sky, small knots of stragglers had begun to pass the ruin of the aid station. They walked with dragging steps, uniforms filmed with dust and soot, faces blank. Most had long since discarded their heavy equipment. Rifles hung muzzles down, or not at all. They did not look to the medic's patch on Leitner's arm, did not call out for bandages or morphine. They hurried past as if crossing a haunted intersection, heads slightly lowered, intent on minimizing the time they spent in any place that might be shelled again. Scenes like this had repeated for 10 days, an unspoken report that the army had given up expecting anything from its own parts. No one relied on anyone anymore. Leitner watched one such group disappear between the crumpled walls of a warehouse, then lowered his eyes and resumed counting what was left of the gauze. He had no reason by his own rules to pause for them. No one had formally declared this aid station non-functional. As long as he continued to sort, as long as instruments were laid out somewhere near their taut positions, as long as bandages retained the shape that allowed them to be unrolled in one movement, this place remained to him theoretically restorable. He had been taught that when chaos descended, preserving the flow of procedure mattered more than any single action. So even when the sun climbed enough to cast hard light over the collapsed rafters and shattered tiles, even when his fingers began to stiffen with cold and exhaustion, he continued to rehearse the sequence: clamps, scissors, gauze, syringe, bandage, broken, missing, stained. These external facts could not yet dislodge his stubborn insistence that the order remain visible. It was as if his identity had become fused to the sequence itself. If the order could be pieced back together, so could he. Around midday, a deep, spreading vibration rolled up through the ground and into his knees. It was not artillery. It was the low, steady rumble of armored columns moving through the valley roads, American tank and half-track treads pressing the earth with weight and continuity. This sound had been present somewhere in the Ruhr for days now. It meant that another industrial town's defensive shell was about to crack. Many German remnants, hearing that rumble, had decided to raise whatever cloth they could and walk toward the nearest road with their hands up. Leitner, hearing it, instinctively linked it to something else: the preparatory phase before an inspection, the beat of boots before a procedure. He did not think of escape. He did not think yet of surrender. He thought, this is the step before the next step, whatever that might be, something that, if correctly followed, would assign him a place again. As dusk thickened the air, he opened the waterlogged register book and tried to smooth its warped pages flat. The ink had blurred into blue-gray whirls. Names and dates ran together. He pressed the edges down anyway and held the book open, eyes narrowed, as if by willing concentration he could render the entries legible again. The content had ceased to matter. The act of holding the register, of turning the paper, of fixing his attention on it, signaled to him that records existed. And if there were records, there might yet be a next report, a next form. The whole day, the real world seemed to slide further away from him, beyond the walls and ridges, while the order he touched existed only in his hands and in the exactness of his movements. In a place without orders, without superiors, without structure, he continued, almost stubbornly, to maintain a station that no longer existed in any command's plan. After dark, the cold rose again from the churned earth. He retied the straps of his sleeve patch, like a guard clipping his badge back into view, as if some long-gone supervising doctor might appear at any moment and ask who was on duty. Distant booms drifted over from the direction of Hagen, warehouses being deliberately burned, rail yards blown to deny use. The vast Ruhr industrial belt had become a continuous field of dead machinery and broken glass. Yet he remained as if in an intermission, waiting for the first line of a new script to be delivered. By the next morning, mist lay thicker in the valleys. Shards of tile, snapped beams, and twisted sheet metal appeared darker under its weight, as if an invisible pressure had pressed the colors down. Even without reading English, Leitner could infer the meaning of the arrows and symbols. To assembly point, to medical station, road unsafe. The angles of the boards, the positions at intersections, all announced desired directions. He watched a minute, then slowly pulled back into the interior shadows. He did not step out. He was not ready to cross some invisible line between waiting and presenting himself. In his mind, the proper moment would be when the process explicitly called for him, when some signal changed from general to specific, when the flowchart reached his box. Until then, stepping forward felt like disrupting the sequence. Toward evening, the broadcasts grew louder. Loudspeakers were raised onto higher mounds of rubble or strapped to vehicles that moved deliberately along main streets. The voices no longer cut in and out but washed continuously over the ruins. Their phrases grew more direct. Stop all resistance at once. Wounded will be treated. Prisoners of war will be handled according to international regulations. The meaning for most German soldiers was clear enough. For Leitner, the syntax still felt like an outer ring of instructions, a series of headers before the real processing began. He listened as others might follow a train schedule, waiting for a platform number or a departure time that applied to them. He half expected to hear divisions or towns named, some clause that would narrow the generic "you" of the broadcast down to "you, here, now." The night that followed, he spent again among his rearranged instruments. He picked up a tongue depressor, wiped soot from it with the corner of his sleeve, and placed it neatly beside a cracked thermos. He knew such actions had no therapeutic point. There were no patients to receive examinations, but lining up the tools kept the outline of a treatment space visible to him. He laid the broken items out once more in a thin, straight row, adjusted two so their handles matched. There was no senior doctor to check, no wounded man waiting. His actions were for himself, a repeated declaration that he was still in position. When at last he slid down against the crumbling wall and sat, the wind cut through the window opening with a damp chill. He traced the stitching of the cross on his sleeve with his fingertips slowly, as if confirming that each thread remained. In his mind, he recited like a stripped-down litany the steps of triage, registration, assessment, grading, transfer. Each word he had once used as a command now came out like a prayer. He knew the world outside was transforming into some new, layered order. Military zones, occupation districts, reconstruction plans. Allied staff officers were already sketching charts on clean paper in towns he had never seen. His only task, as he understood it, was to remain recognizable when that order reached him. If the enemy's system was built on procedures similar to his own, forms, categories, station numbers, then his best chance was to stay within the vocabulary they would recognize. Sometime toward dawn, a reddish glow flared briefly along the horizon, another fuel dump, burning itself out. Smoke thickened, making even the broken bricks look pale and powdered. The campaign was reshaping the Ruhr with both steel and paper, guns at the front, administrative orders in the rear. Leitner had, without quite realizing it, begun to interpret that vast apparatus in one specific way, as a system that, sooner or later, would admit him. He did not know precisely what he was waiting for, only that someone would come, that some voice would call, that some step would begin, and that when it did, he needed to be in the correct posture, sleeves straight, tools aligned, available to be placed, because if one could still be placed, one still existed. By late morning, the echoes between the empty streets had grown denser. Engine noise filtered through the irregular gaps of ruined buildings and hills, came and went in waves, broken by the faint clank of metal on metal, tools, chains, links in a process. The rhythm was steady, but not rushed. American columns inside the pocket were no longer racing, they were consolidating. Leitner heard tires crunch on broken stone near his building and felt his body tighten. He forced his breathing to stay even. Years of training had drilled into him that an outwardly calm medic calmed the men around him. Now the habit kept his hands from shaking. He could tell, just from the sound of the footsteps that followed, that these were not exhausted German stragglers. Their spacing was longer. Their weight distribution suggested full equipment and good boots. The faint rattle of tools indicated engineers or special detachments, not infantry in fighting order. Voices, English, rose and fell outside, one calling to another in a tone that sounded more like coordination than alarm. A word was shouted near the corner, then repeated more quietly, perhaps as a reminder of some detail, and metal struck stone again. He crept toward the jagged window opening and angled his head to see. On the street, 4 engineers were inspecting the culvert and road edge. 2 medical soldiers walked with them, packs marked with visible red crosses. They moved with the calm, methodical focus of men who expected to stay in this place for some time. No one was ducking. No one glanced nervously over a shoulder. They were not hunting. They were preparing. Leitner held himself back in the shadow. He was close enough to step out and show himself, close enough to speak. But he wanted, felt he needed, some clearer signal that this was the correct moment, some gesture from them that called for individuals rather than just area cleared or road open. So he waited. The engineers continued their work. They had a road to secure, a route for vehicles and stretchers to pass along. They checked drainage, shoveled loose debris aside, set another signpost in place. None of this required them to look into ruined rooms. Leitner felt his chest tighten again. He counted his breaths silently, 4 in, 4 out, as if he were about to perform a delicate procedure. It was a way of clinging to a rule while the rest of his reference points slid. Then one of the medics broke off from the group and walked toward the broken wall. He seemed to be checking for water pipes, perhaps a cistern. He stooped, felt along the stones, knocked with his knuckles, and listened. The way he leaned in, eyes narrowed, fingertips tracing the line of a crack, was uncannily similar to Leitner's own posture when examining a patient's airway. A small rock, dislodged by the medic's tapping, rolled down and hit another with a bright, hollow sound. The echo carried cleanly into the interior. It was such a slight noise, but for Leitner it felt like a line thrown across a gap. If there was ever a moment when the other system might notice he existed, it would be this. He straightened. He adjusted his sleeve patch once more. He stepped into the portion of the room where the light fell more clearly. His back was upright, knees slightly bent but still, hands resting lightly on a bandage roll in front of him. It was a posture that, in his mind, advertised currently at station. It made no demands but declared readiness. The medic outside lifted his head. His gaze swept the interior, broken wall, collapsed furniture, scattered equipment, and then, abruptly, fixed on the figure in the half-light. The beam of the flashlight followed his eyes and stopped this time. It did not flick away. For half a heartbeat, the American froze. Then he raised his hand and called to the others. Boots crunched over stone. 2 engineers entered the doorway with weapons at a low ready, checking corners by habit. The medic moved faster, closing the distance to Leitner. He did not reach for a gun. His eyes moved with the precise scanning motion of a professional checking vital signs. Head, chest, hands, expression. Leitner held still. Inside, he felt 2 contradictory currents collide. A loosening relief that at last the network had reached him, and a deeper, quieter rupture. The sensation of an inner wall he had held up for days beginning to crack. The medic looked him over and gave a short instruction to one of the others. Leitner did not catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Categorizing. Not as threat, but as needs attention. They took him lightly by the arms and guided him out of the ruined doorway. Their grip was firm but not rough. Sunlight fell full on him for the first time in days, making him blink. Dust and soot showed on his uniform. The sleeve patch stood out as a darkened oval on the fabric. Outside, he saw the broader pattern that had previously been just glimpses. Signs planted at intersections, white tape marking walkways, trucks idling at the edge of a square, field medics moving between groups. It was a temporary order, improvised over rubble, but nonetheless coherent. In that web of arrows and ropes and routines, he felt, distinctly, that a space had opened for him. That space, he realized, was not assigned because of his qualifications or rank. It was not a slot for Feldwebel Sanitätsdienst. It existed simply because someone had decided that every breathing body encountered here should be given a place to sit, to drink, to be written down. At the intake area, the medic took his pulse, checked capillary refill in his fingers, asked him in simple German if he felt dizzy or short of breath. His hands were steady. He showed no sign of thinking. This is an enemy. He was doing what his training demanded in any case: determine hypothermia risk, dehydration, shock. A canteen was pressed into Leitner's hand. He drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly metallic, but it flowed down into a throat that had been dry for too long and spread warmth through his chest. Military policemen watched from a short distance, but did not interfere. The sequence unfolded around Leitner as if he had stepped into a familiar procedure, one whose headings he already knew, but whose content had been quietly rewritten. As they led him toward the temporary collection point, he passed an open field where dozens of German soldiers sat on the grass. Some had blankets draped over their shoulders. A few lay on stretchers. Others sat hunched, arms around knees. Their faces were tired, but no longer pinched with immediate fear. Tags hung from their uniforms. They had numbers now, lines on forms in some American ledger. The light fell equally on them all, friend and foe alike. They were no longer functional units or weapon carriers. They were entries in a system that, for the moment, existed to process human beings out of the catastrophe. Leitner was given a spot on a crate to sit. The medic checked him once more, then moved on. A clerk with a clipboard approached with an interpreter. Questions were asked: name, age, unit, any injuries. The clerk's pen scratched steadily. When he finished, he clipped a small tag with a number onto Leitner's sleeve. It did not say medic. It did not say aid post. It was simply a code, a pointer to his place in a larger scheme. He realized as he looked at the tag that he had indeed entered a system of rehabilitation, only not in the sense of restoring him to combat or to duty. This system's first concern was that his body continue, that he not die in a ditch simply because no one had room for him. Toward evening, the sky above the reception area faded to a flat blue. The wind carried dampness, but not much smoke anymore. Fires had mostly burned out or been brought under control. Leitner sat on his crate, listening and watching. He noticed how nurses and doctors passed instruments to one another with brief, non-barked phrases, how stretchers were loaded and unloaded with small, practiced gestures, the passing of paperwork from one desk to another, the calling out of tag numbers, the guiding of prisoners to latrine lines. All of it was procedural. Yet the hardness he associated with military procedure was softened here. There was urgency but no rage, efficiency without contempt. Slowly, he understood. All along, he had clung to procedure not because of the content of the instructions, but because they proved that he had a location in some larger design. Now an entirely different framework had given him a place, and this time he had not had to prove his usefulness first. When night came down fully, he let his shoulders drop. For the first time since the pocket had closed around them, he relaxed something more than his muscles. He felt a hollow in himself, a space where the old identity had cracked. It did not feel like fear. It felt like a piece of ground cleared for building. It dawned on him that captivity was not only a form of control. It could also be, in this odd and limited sense, a way of catching those who would otherwise simply fall through. Years later, working as an equipment clerk in a hospital near Bonn, Leitner still laid out instruments with an almost excessive precision. He lined up trays, folded linens, stacked gauze. Order remained his language. But the purpose of that order had changed. He no longer organized to convince some faceless headquarters of his worth. He did it so that the next nurse, the next doctor could find what they needed quickly, and the next patient would not have to wait. He had once feared the collapse of a system because he believed that if it vanished, he would vanish with it. In the years after the war, he came to see that systems could also be rebuilt around people instead of over them, that they could, at least in principle, be designed to recognize humanity rather than grind it into parts. When he thought back to the Ruhr Pocket, what haunted him most was not the ruins themselves, nor the smoke columns, nor the maps with their converging arrows. It was one particular moment in the dark of a broken building, the first American search team passing by without noticing him, the beam of light sliding over him, and then away. In retrospect, that near miss felt like a line in his life. On one side, a world in which people existed only as long as a system named them. On the other, the gradual recognition that a system could also choose to acknowledge people because they existed. The Ruhr Pocket left behind collapsed factories and shattered roads. From its wreckage, Leitner carried out only a faint, stubborn insight. When structures fail, what remains of a person? When structures return, how should a life be placed within them? He never claimed to know the full answer, but he had come to suspect that the strongest kind of order is not made of steel or orders shouted downhill, but of the part of our nature that can, even amid ruins, still make room for each individual to be seen, recorded, and cared for, simply because they are there.